So one of the things that you talk about on Twitter is the viral funnel. Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah. So, I tweeted about this in March, but basically there's lots of different efforts, flying around, and where do you want to help? So, ideally where it saves the most lives given your skills. So, the funnel model comes from like startups, right? You've got a bunch of leads at the top of the funnel. These are people who might, be out there, and then some of them click and land on your website, and some of them click a little bit more, and they end up in a cart, and then some of them all the way convert, and so on, right? And maybe they renew subscription or they churn. It might seem like trivial startup lingo, but you can apply the same thing to the virus, right? You've got this, group of healthy people out there, then they're exposed. Then some of them get infected, some of them get sick, some of them actually die or recover. That's similar to like the SCIR models, epidemiological models, and so on. And so you can think of interventions at different portions of the viral funnel. For example, like, for healthy people, masks, social distancing, lockdown, vaccines, tests, those kind of, are things you can do on healthy people. When you talk about if someone's exposed, you do more tests, you do CT scan, you do, not just PCR, but you might do, sequencing or whatever, if you think they're being exposed to, a strain that you want to know about. If they're infected, then you'd actually isolate them. You need, you need hospital beds or some kind of quarantine, area. You're going to potentially need drugs. If they're really sick, then hospitalization, PPE for MDs and nurses. And if they're recovered, maybe serology tests. And so now once you kind of have that funnel, when you say, okay, I'm doing PPE, okay, you're actually at like stage 4 of the funnel, right? Because you're helping sick people, because you're giving PPE to MDs and nurses. Oh, but maybe you might help at the top of the funnel as well, because some of those masks could go to people who are healthy. So in this fashion, you can kind of think about where you want to allocate resources. And really, the best thing you could do is stop healthy people from getting sick in the first place. And so that's why for the last few weeks of March and early April, I was helping out Jeremy P. Howard, who launched Masks for All, which is very effective in basically shifting policy on this, where the Surgeon General was at first saying, oh, people, you shouldn't wear masks, and then literally recorded himself making a video of wearing a mask, which is good. I'm glad they turned around on this, right? But essentially that common sense intervention is something that we think will significantly reduce the spread of the disease. So that's the idea of the viral funnel, is to prioritize different things, interventions based on the impact on the funnel.
The frightening thing about hearing you discuss that is it sounds as though that sort of thinking hasn't broadly taken place at scale yet. It sounds as though the basic sort of staging and framework of this is still at the position where it's a novel idea.
Yeah. So, the thing that has been concerning to me about this, this whole way, is this whole thing is rear-wheel drive, where, the folks with scientific, technical, mathematical, management backgrounds are not in politics, and they're generally not in the media either, at least as writers. And, so what that means is the folks who are talking about what to do and the folks who are responsible for making the decisions are just not, there isn't a critical mass of folks, who know what a virus is, for example, right? And so like, it's not a partisan thing, by the way. It's the federal bureaucracy. It is the mayor of New York and the White House. It is the FDA and the CDC. It is, like both, all major media outlets have had just the flu type stuff, and not just the flu, but masks don't work, and then masks work. Just face plan after face plan on this. So I think, I'm pretty concerned about the fact that the folks who I think of as competent are outside of the loop on making decisions on this, or are doing kind of rear-wheel drive, right? You're tweeting frantically to try to get the attention of somebody, as opposed to just being in the position to make the decision yourself.
Another suggestion that's getting a fair amount of traction is this notion of immunity passports. This is something that's filtered out into the mainstream media at this point. Could you explain that concept and tell us where we are with regard to being able to actually execute on that?
Yeah, so that's something, basically immunity passports or proof of health, that could help reopen the world, whether it's based on serology testing, which is, hey, do you have antibodies like immunity in that sense, or some other kind of test. Essentially, for example, in Asia, people have forehead thermometers and they stand outside of buildings and they kind of scan people as they walk by. And that's not a perfect test, because people can be asymptomatic and still pass and so on. But it gives you subsignal. And so you can start thinking about defense in depth, right? You have, for example, wearables like your Fitbit, your Oura. There's studies going into whether that gives you signal. There's your forehead thermometers. There's certainly your self-report. There is the digital diagnosis of whether you're close to somebody else, contact tracing, were you close to another positive? Can we send you a signal on that basis, which, smartphone manufacturers can do now? I know it's Orwellian, but they can. Another test is these kind of thermal scans from afar. There's like these really high throughput CT scans that the Chinese have where it's really fast and they can do a bunch of them quickly. There's obviously PCR, there's, sequencing. And so you start to have defense in depth, right? And something I tweeted about, I said, China's going to build the third Great Wall as a function of this. There's the Great Wall, the Great Firewall. They're building the Great Bio Wall of China, like a gigantic biodefense wall of testing and other kinds of things, eventually vaccines, to just fortify themselves in many different ways so that the virus breaks through one fortification, it doesn't break through another and yet another. And so that's, I think, a good mental model also for proof of health or these immunity passports where, you have a series of tests that are done on somebody. And, in China, the way they're doing it is green code, yellow code, red code. Your WeChat has, either green, yellow, or red corresponding to your current virus status, right? So green is you're fine, yellow, you've been exposed and need to be quarantined, you can't travel between cities and so on, and red, you're known to be infected. And so that digital status is contagious, just like, the virus is. If a red walked into a crowd of 20 greens, they would all turn yellow, for example, right? At least that's that's one's understanding of it. So that's the kind of stuff that all goes into something like this immunity passport. And frankly, in a sense, it already existed because, you need vaccination certificates to immigrate to a country, right? The U.S. has needed that for a long time. If you Google vaccination certificate. So this is kind of like that. A vaccination cert is, are you going to bring a deadly virus, into our shores? That's the same reason they ask, are you bringing in snails? Are you bringing in, like animals and stuff like that? They'll always ask those kinds of questions, the agricultural things. So they want to know, are you bringing something that can reproduce of its own accord and maybe get out of control of, something that has no natural predators, all the type of stuff, unbalanced ecosystems. And I think that's what this is. It's like a vaccination cert. It's like one of those questions about whether you're bringing in animals, except it's applied to a virus. And it's also done obviously in much more intrusive and real-time way.
And on the treatment side of this equation, you talked a bit about the expanding the right to try. Tell us a little bit about what that is and why it's relevant for getting the kind of treatments that we need to see.
Yeah. So, what the FDA did in February was basically catastrophic. It's now known that they prevented emergency use authorizations for tests, and in so doing, turned a containable epidemic into a catastrophe. They basically, what essentially happened was labs that could have run tests that would have shown that the coronavirus epidemic was it was spreading. They were prevented from running tests by the FDA for a critical 28-day period, and only really allowed to run on the 29th. Once the tests actually started to run, it was clear that we had a massive outbreak on our hands. And so where, things might have been nipped in the bud, because what happened was the lack of testing gave everybody a false sense of security over the course of February when the fire was still, at a relatively early stage. So it's my point. My point is that's potentially the greatest failure in the history of not just the FDA, maybe one of the greatest failures ever in the history of, the United States. It costs the country trillions of dollars, tens of millions of jobs, simply because, bureaucrats didn't approve tests fast enough. And that's just something that's perceptible to people. It's a catastrophe on such a scale that's perceptible. Most other times that something is denied for multiple sclerosis or like colon cancer, it's not visible on that scale, right? It's not something where everybody has a stake in it, where, like it's super, there's lots of eyes on it. It's more deniable. So with respect to the FDA, there's been paths to route around it in the past. And critically, those paths don't say no regulation. They just say a different regulator to put some competitive pressure on this regulator. So some of them, for example, compounding pharmacies are one where, pharmacists have some discretion in order to kind of mix drugs together to get a new drug. off-label prescription by MDs. You can have a drug that's approved for purpose A that a doctor in their own discretion can prescribe for purpose B. There's been CLIA and clinical labs where you can basically go and have individual labs that are not necessarily FDA regulated, but they're regulated by a different agency, also under HHS, under CMS. So HHS is a parent, it's got FDA and it's got CMS. Under CMS is something called CLIA, and CLIA works with state regulators to approve clinical labs which can roll out tests. And then, of course, there's other countries. And so each of these are pathways that are outside of the FDA. And the FDA wants to shut them down. Usually, they've been kind of waging a war against lab tests and compounding pharmacies and so on for a while. Right to try is yet another pathway outside the FDA where basically people have, as it sounds like, the right to try a drug, and they just have state regulators sign off on it, and then under some circumstances give notice to the FDA because the procedure for actually getting approval to use a drug is actually extremely bureaucratic normally, and the person is dying. And so now you just give a notice to the FDA rather than going through that whole rigmarole. One thing also, by the way, a lot of the FDA stuff, when it blocks things, it causes failure to apply rather than necessarily failure to get approved. And those are similar in outcome, but failure to apply is less measurable because it's top of the funnel. It's such a complicated and time-consuming process that people don't even put in an application, and therefore it's harder to detect the full impact of what it is they're doing, if that makes sense. Because many of these companies and labs that were turned down for these authorizations, EUAs, made out of file formal applications. They just got informal feedback that okay, they can't get one at a time. So what does this have to do with expanded right to try? So right now, there's all these different pathways outside the FDA for drugs via off-label, for labs via CLIA, for drugs again via compounding pharmacies, for pretty much everything via going internationally like medical tourism. An expanded right to try would basically just expand all of this. And one model would be something where these, like, for example, this Western States Compact, right? California, Oregon, Washington, and now also Colorado and Nevada have joined this, okay? So this Western States Compact now could basically say, look, we're going to have Stanford, UW, Berkeley, UCSF, and Cedars-Sinai, which are all very legit, basically on the West Coast, right? Maybe throw in, UC Boulder, something like that. And those are universities that will work with state regulators to approve drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines and what have you. You do the same thing for this Upper Midwest Compact, where the Mayo Clinic is working with, the local regulators to approve things. And the same thing in the Northeast, you have Harvard and MIT, and the same thing in the New York kind of tri-state area compact, you have Columbia and Cornell. And by doing this, now suddenly you've got 4, 5, 6 effectively regulators in each of these regions has like 80 million people or something fairly big, right? They're like essentially European countries. But now there's competition for the FDA, and you're not giving up on safety. You're not giving up on quality. What you've got, though, are folks who have an incentive to balance quality with speed and with cost, which really, really matter in a pandemic. Very obviously so, but like it's also true at other times. It's just not something where everybody's eyes are on it.
Are you optimistic about our ability to actually execute on this in a reasonable time frame in a way that can get actual results for this particular crisis, or is this something that we're going to look at for potentially mitigating future issues?
So expanded right to try would be, if not a silver bullet, certainly a very, very useful bullet that could be tried right now that would unlock a lot of biomedical innovation. And I think, frankly, it's the only way. Yes, the horse has left the barn in some ways. The fire is going to burn for quite a while, but it's, we need to, even if this fire burns the U.S. more than it burns other countries, and it looks like it will, we still need fire hoses. So we have to unlock that biomedical innovation, even if, I shouldn't say too little, too late, because it would be great if this had been done 5 years ago. 5 years ago, for example, the Apple Watch had a bunch of diagnostic grade stuff in it that the FDA forced them to either take out or nerf. This is reported in the Wall Street Journal, for example. And so had that been in there, had, for example, 23andMe, the FDA ran a campaign against them, if we had 100 million people with genome sequences, maybe we'd know the pharmacogenomics and immunogenomics of this thing, right? So, yes, it would have been much better had we done this 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But today is better than never. And that'll at least give us the technology where in 6 months, we'll be in even a few months, we'd be in a very different place if you have right to try, expanded right to try.